Super.
Okay, we're recording now, so
I think we'll go ahead and make
I'll give the introduction. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on professional review with IMechE. So this webinar is going to cover mainly your questions on virtual review, and there would be some changes to previously how it's done in person. So I'm sure your questions will be answered over the next hour or so. I'd like to introduce Sandra and Stuart. So Sandra is a business development manager with IMechE and runs many workshops and application workshops for getting your application ready for chartership and also for continued professional development. I've personally went to one of the application workshops in Glasgow and found it very useful. Also, Stuart is a PRI assessor, and has many years experience with professional reviews, and he's now taking on a role as a facilitator. So it will be interesting to find out what's involved in this new role and also how he views his experience, professional reviews, and how it can ultimately help all you guys in your own applications. So as Sandra said before, there is a chat available, and it would be very useful if you put in the chat thanks so far for your introductions and also any questions that you have. And at the end of the presentation, we'll get a chance to go through all of the questions in a Q&A. During the presentation, I'll also very conveniently put links in, as Sandra mentions, links in the presentation that will be useful. So look out for those links and also a couple of frequently asked questions. So yeah, if you bear with me, I've got just 2 minutes just to talk about the Edinburgh Young Members Panel, of which I'm chair at the moment. And you can follow our events and get in touch to join the panel and get involved through, first of all, the Near You webpage for IMechE is always useful, where you found this event. Local events will be shown there, Facebook and Twitter, and also LinkedIn. So I would look just IMechE EYMP on Facebook, and you should find us easily enough there. And the next event with the Edinburgh Young Members Panel is Speak Out for Engineering next Wednesday, the 11th at this, and there'll be it's great for seeing the best of the presentations by Edinburgh, Glasgow and Aberdeen, because it's the regional final. So 10 to 20 minute presentations on engineering topics. You'll find it very because I have over the last previous years, you tend to get great topics varying all over types of engineering, and it's good. It'll be all online. So with that said, I hope you are well enough introduced now to take it on. So thanks, guys. Sandra, I'll pass it over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Andy. And thanks everybody for joining us this evening. I'm Sandra, work with the business development team based in Glasgow. So normally an event like this would be taking place in Glasgow. We'd all be seeing each other face to face, but we probably only have people from Glasgow attending. So this evening is interesting, as indeed all the webinars have been very interesting, because we now are finding we're getting a global audience at our events. So the agenda that I've put together for you this evening will be covering, Stuart and I between us will be covering what the professional review interview is all about, who you can actually expect to have in the room or in the virtual room with you on the day, so who'll be in attendance, what you're actually going to be assessed on, how you're going to be scored, because you will be scored based on the answers that you provide to the questions that are put to you on the day. Top tips to remember and things to try and avoid doing. I've also got a nice case history to share with you this evening, somebody who was recently successful, and they've shared their thoughts on how they found the online professional review interview, and then what happens after your interview takes place. Also want to spend a few minutes talking about CPD, because when you're awarded registration, you must commit to doing CPD, and we are now required to audit at least 5% of our members every year. So just so that you know exactly what to expect in terms of CPD and the kind of record we might look from you. As Andy said earlier, please do post any questions you have in the chat box, and we'll be able to deal with those at the end. And if you'd like a copy of the slides, please just drop me an email and I will be able to send a copy of the slides out to you after this evening. So I do have to say before I start, you will find some of the slides are a little bit wordy, and that's really so that they will be useful for you to refer to back after today, because we found in doing webinars over the last couple of months, frequently people ask for a copy of the slides. They want a document that they can refer back to. So some of the slides have got quite a bit of text on them, really so that they're going to be useful tools to you after this evening. So without further ado, I'll move on. So what is the professional review interview? I can see from the chat, I sort of anticipated that some people who joined the event this evening would not in fact be ready to do their interview just now, but are planning to do their interview next year. So I thought it would be useful just to do a very brief overview of the steps that are involved in getting to professional review interview. And I'll go through these slides really quickly with you. But the way I like to explain registration to people is that there are 3 distinct steps. So the first step is you need to show to us that you meet the academic requirements for the grade of registration that you're applying for. Then you need to show to us that you've developed competence as a professional engineer. So for chartered engineer status, you will need to have an accredited MEng or equivalent. And for incorporated engineer status, you'll need to have an accredited BEng or equivalent. You'll need to then develop at least 3 to 4 years as a minimum of relevant work experience. So typically an MEng in 4 years is the requirement for chartered engineer status, and a BEng in at least 3 years is the requirement for incorporated engineer status. But it's very important to highlight that everybody will have different opportunities available to them, different work ethic, whole variety of different factors. So it's not automatic that if you've been working for 4 years, you'll meet the requirements. It really depends on you as an individual. And the third part of the process is you need to show to us that through your work experience, you've met the competence requirements, and you give us evidence of how you meet those competence requirements by writing up an application form. And in that application form, we look for about 400 words of evidence on how you meet each of those competence requirements. And when your application is submitted to us, we will review it, and if everything is in order with your application, so if on paper it looks as though you meet the requirements, we'll invite you to attend a professional review interview, and we'll explain to you exactly what's involved with that process this evening. So if you're successful, you'll be awarded professional registration. Career learning assessment could be an option instead of fully meeting the academic requirements. But my colleagues in our membership department and our colleagues in the business development team will be able to advise you on that process. So if you're successful at interview, you will be awarded registration. And just to mention, an interview is not required for engineering technician registration. So step 1 is, do you meet the academic requirements for the grade of registration that you wish to apply for? We've got a qualifications checker on our website. So if you've used that already, that's great. If you haven't used it, I would encourage you to use it. You can see the link on the screen just now, and Andy will post the link in the chat box as well. Qualifications checker on our website, that's the first thing you need to use to see if the academic qualification you hold meets our academic requirements. If it does, that's great. If it's a non-accredited degree, we will ask you to do an academic review, and in some cases you may be able to use evidence from your technical work experience in lieu of a formal academic qualification through our career learning assessment process. But again, more information on that process can be provided by myself and my colleagues in the business development team. Now, the competence of all professional engineers is assessed against a framework which is called UK Spec. And UK Spec stands for UK Standards for Professional Engineering Competence. So there's 5 competence statements for CEng, another 5 for IEng, and a different 5 for EngTech. So the framework is defined by the Engineering Council, and then each engineering institution interprets it. So very briefly, Competence A is all about your knowledge and understanding of engineering principles. How have you used the academic knowledge you gained as part of your degree and applied it in the workplace? B is all about your ability to solve engineering problems. C is all about your leadership or management skills. D is all about your communication and interpersonal skills. And E is all about the code of conduct. So 5 competence requirements. And as an applicant for CEng or IEng registration, you need to give us at least 400 words of evidence. So evidence on how you meet those competence requirements. Now, full details of these competence requirements and examples of how you could meet them are detailed in the guidance notes. And the guidance notes you can find on the website. So 400 words on each competence, and they are defined more clearly in the guidance notes. So as a starting point, if you haven't been onto the website and if you haven't found the guidance notes as yet, or if perhaps you weren't even aware that they were there, I would encourage you to go on and have a look at them and read them, because we spent a lot of time in pulling them together, and they really do give you a good overview of exactly what's required. And myself and my colleagues regularly run workshops where we can give you more detailed guidance on what's involved. So more detailed guidance on the academic requirements, on what we look for in an application form, help you with writing up your application form, and help you with reviewing it, etc. So lots of help and guidance and support is available to you. But if everything is in order with your application form, so if you go through those processes that I've very briefly alluded to, you will be invited to attend an interview. Now, that interview is an opportunity really for you to discuss your evidence of how you meet the competence requirements with our interviewers and convince them that you're suitable to be elected as a chartered or incorporated member of IMechE. Now, the assessors will already have read your application before you get to your interview. And we often get asked, does IMechE match up interviewers with interviewees? No, we don't. So an interviewer may be from or may have had a career in oil and gas or automotive or manufacturing, a huge variety of different industry sectors. And the applicant may have worked in a completely different industry sector. So during a typical day of interviews, an interviews assessor the first applicant could be somebody who's worked in academia, the second could be somebody who's worked in railways, third person could be from oil and gas, fourth person could be from biomedical, and the fifth person could be from nuclear, for example. So you can see straight away, it's very important that you as an applicant explain what you've been doing and what you've achieved clearly and concisely in the application form, so that the assessor can immediately form a picture of you and what you've been doing, and then can ask you questions during the interview. So all of the questions that we ask you on the day will be directly related to your application. And very important to highlight as well that the success rate at interview is over 90%. So the vast majority of people who attend the interview are successful. So that's very important to bear in mind, because lots of people get very anxious about the process, get a bit stressed at the thought of doing an interview. Do please bear in mind that if you're in front of the interview panel, that means on paper you look like a good, strong applicant. Now, pre-COVID, this is how the interviews were conducted. 4 people typically in a room around a table, just as you see in the picture. There's, in the UK, an interviews facilitator, 2 assessors and the applicant. But obviously since March, with the global pandemic, we've had to change our interview process and move them online. So instead of being a face-to-face interview, it's now a virtual interview, and it's normally conducted over Microsoft Teams as a 4-way video conference call. But please do bear in mind, this is a new process and it's evolving all the time as the software is getting better, etc. So please do bear with us. Obviously, the circumstances we're all living through globally have caused huge amount of changes for everybody. We're no exception. We had hundreds of interviews lined up, which had to be cancelled. We had to retrain assessors, huge variety of different things. But the online interviews process is up and running for a few months now, and so far seems to be running smoothly and running well. So what actually happens before you're invited to interview? Well, if you're based in the UK, my colleagues in the membership team will invite you to go online and book an interview date once your application has been processed. And the interview will be conducted using Microsoft Teams as the platform as a four-way video conference call. So my colleagues will get in touch with you and offer to do a test with you if you're not familiar with the platform. You can also share additional documentation through screen sharing on the day. You must use a laptop, an iPad, or a desktop computer. You can't use a phone at the moment. That may change in the months ahead, but currently you need to use a laptop, iPad, or desktop computer, just so that it can be a four-way call and you can see the faces of the people who are involved in interviewing and assessing you. You also need to have a photo ID, which shows your photo, your date of birth, etc., before the interview can go ahead. And the next slide I've pulled together is really to give practical advice to you for your online interview. So I would say this is probably one of the most important slides this evening. Now, a lot of this stuff I think you'll already be familiar with, but hopefully it will provide some useful tips and information for you. So first thing is, can be useful to have a headset with a microphone to ensure that you've got a clear audio connection. For most people, you've been on a journey for sort of 8, 9, 10 years to be in front of this interview panel. The interview only lasts for about 45 minutes. It's not a huge amount of time. You want to make sure that you nail it and that you convince them that you're competent and suitable to be elected as a chartered or incorporated engineer. Headset generally allows you to have clearer communication with the interview panel. Not a requirement, but I would suggest you look into that, or good quality earphones can work as well. Don't forget to choose clothing that you would normally wear to a business meeting. With everybody working from home for the past couple of months, I think we've all been getting into the habit of dressing down. Do bear in mind that this is a professional business meeting, so think about what you're going to wear and perhaps think about wearing something a little bit smarter than you would normally wear for a day at home when you perhaps aren't on camera at all that particular day. Very practical, and it might seem very, very obvious, but in the face-to-face interviews that were conducted in the past, you would come along to a meeting room where refreshments would be provided as a matter of course. With the online interviews, you'll be doing it at home or in your place of work. Make sure you've got a drink to hand so that you don't literally dry up during the course of the interview. Make sure that you also turn off your notifications, so anything that could interrupt you during your interview, so phones, emails, text messages, etc., because you don't want to be in full flow and the next thing interrupted and you lose your concentration. You might also want to think about things like the background, lighting. If you're going to do your interview at home, perhaps background noise. If you've got pets, if you've got dogs, for example, that bark anytime somebody passes by the window outside, you might want to think about that as well. Also, another practical thing to think about is your broadband bandwidth. So if, for example, you're sharing your home with your partner who's perhaps also working from home, or if you've got young children who are on devices, or perhaps teenagers who are on Netflix or gaming, etc., that can affect the bandwidth. And you don't want to be in the middle of your interview and then suddenly your system crashes because it can't cope with the demand that's been placed on it. So that's the kind of thing you want to give some thought to before the interview takes place, rather than have your system crash on the day. So for example, this evening, I've had to tell both my children they can't use their devices for the next hour when I've been on this call. And make sure on a practical level, you've got your application form beside you and any other relevant documents to hand. So hopefully that's some useful and practical advice for you in terms of getting set up for your interview. I'm now going to pass over to Stuart, and Stuart is going to share all the secrets of how to have a successful professional review interview. So over to you, please, Stuart.
Thank you, Sandra. Good evening, everyone. As Andy mentioned, I'm Stuart Aikenhead. I have been an assessor, co-panellist and chair, mainly in the Scottish region for many years. And over the last year, I've become an interview facilitator. So I no longer actually perform interviews unless one of the two assessors doesn't turn up for whatever reason. If you could move on to the next slide, please, Sandra. So the panel is a chairman and a co-panelist. The chairman is usually the most experienced interviewer who will have been conducting interviews for a number of years. Both will be CEng, either IMechE or FIMechE. An interview facilitator, him or herself, will also be an FIMechE CEng and able to step in if there is a problem, if somebody doesn't turn up, which has occasionally happened. The interview facilitator really doesn't take part in the interview once it's started. He or she is there to ensure that the interview is conducted in accordance with the IMechE's requirements and a consistent approach is taken by the panel. There will be a few minutes at the start where the IF will explain that, take you through the format of the interview, and stress that this is about you when you're responding to the questions. We're always taught these days at work about being part of a team and how we're going to collaborate, and it's all about we. This is not an opportunity for that. No time for false modesty. It's very, very much about you and what you've achieved, what your contribution was, and where you used engineering judgment. So, you know, you really have to sell yourself. Don't hide behind a team or pretend that you are just collaborating with somebody else. Only the chair and the co-panelists will ask you questions. Can you just hop back a minute, Sandra, just to the previous one? The IF won't ask any questions. And it's important to remember that the chair and the co-panelist, although the chair will take the lead and ask most of the questions and direct most of it, they both have equal authority in terms of scoring. The chair does not have the authority to have a casting vote. Both have to agree the final recommendation, albeit the scores can vary slightly. If you work in defence or something very commercially sensitive, that confidentiality will be respected, and it should be possible to complete an application form without having to divulge national secrets or company secrets. I worked in defence for many years, so I know how it's difficult sometimes. You may have to get someone in your office to review your application before submitting it to know what's acceptable and what's unacceptable. The assessors will introduce themselves. They will tell you what their their industrial background is, just for your information, and they will probably ask you to introduce yourself and what your current role is as part of the first question for the interview. You could move on, Sandra, thanks. The application form is the basis of the questions, so you must have a copy of the application form with you. And all the documentation that the panel will have seen is the application form. They don't do anything else. They know nothing about your background. They know nothing about your academic assessment. They have your application form. They will be asking you questions about certain projects, certain statements you've made in your application, looking for a bit more detail if they feel the detail's not quite there, or if they don't understand what you've stated. So please don't use jargon. Don't use too many abbreviations without explaining them initially. They'll ask what was most challenging, what was most interesting, and what was most rewarding and satisfying. And this is a discussion. It is called an interview, but it's very much a discussion. You'll do most of the talking, but it is not a presentation. You will be led by the questions that are put to you by the panel. They may ask you to clarify or expand on certain parts of an application which is difficult to explain. So you can use some supporting documentation to illustrate your point. Face-to-face, it's quite easy for someone just to produce a photograph or a drawing or a small component or to sketch something out on a piece of paper. It's not so easy when we're doing it virtually. So you can use the Microsoft Teams share screen facility to do that. We've been using that recently and it has been very successful. Alternatively, if it's just a photograph or a small component, you can hold it up to your webcam. It does work quite well. But please don't produce too much documentation. Don't try and shrink an A0 drawing down to something that can be seen on a laptop screen. It's just completely illegible. So you may have to just create a couple of simple sketches or line diagrams if they're useful. And I would stress that use of these documents is at the behest of the chairman. Chairman will only allow these to be used if he or she feels that they are required and they're appropriate. So please don't try and take over the interview with lots and lots of documents. That will just waste time. So competences A and A to D, which are the more technical competences, will take up probably about half of the interview, 20 to 25 minutes. Don't worry if you're not asked a specific question on each competence or sub-competence. It may be that in discussing an answer to one question, you're responding to something that's going to be asked later on. It may be that you're covering a couple of sub-competences with the answers that you're giving. Some chairs and some co-panelists like to go through point by point by point. Others don't. Move on, please, Sandra. So on the day, Competence E. Now, Competence E is one of the 5 which nobody should have any issue with. It's what we would call in Scotland a gimme. It's really, really easy. These are mandatory questions. The chair and the co-panelist will ask a question of each of the sub-competencies around Competence E. You need to understand the institution's code of conduct. You do not need to memorise it. Just need to be able to relate it to what you do in your everyday work, or relate it to your own organisation or employer's code of conduct. And most of them are very, very similar. So be able to talk about your promotion of the profession and professional integrity, conflicts of interest, etc. Whatever's relevant and important in your particular job. You will also be asked about health and safety at work, safe systems of work. Please don't quote things like, I'm the first aider or I'm a fire warden. These are not relevant. This is about your involvement in health and safety through your professional engineering conduct. Do you design pressure vessels? Do you design safety systems? Do you review risk assessments? Do you prepare risk assessments? Are you responsible for permit to work systems? Whatever, something that you do that makes you aware of health and safety. Do you work to CDM regulations, to pressure systems regs, etc.? Similarly, for sustainable development, it's not about being the recycling champion on the floor of the office and looking at all the photocopying paper that's been wasted. It's about sustainable development, about avoiding pollution, about reuse of materials, about selection of materials, about energy efficiency. Not everyone's heavily involved in that, but you need to be able to relate what you do to something that is appropriate to sustainability. It may be energy efficiency, maybe the use of LED lighting if you're a building services engineer, for example. The assessors will also ask you about your commitment to the profession, and this is the time to bring out your role as a STEM ambassador or someone who helps with graduate recruitment, attends recruitment fairs for apprentices, etc., etc. You're demonstrating that you're committed to the engineering profession. Your development action plan is included within your application form, but it's a very, very summarised part of the form. So bring along your development action plan, something that you can show the panel if it's a bit more detailed, or if it's moved on since you've submitted your application form. It's also important to be realistic within your development action plan, and only put down things that you think are achievable. That should take about 3 or 4 minutes. And at the end of the PRI, you will be asked to add anything that's not been covered. So if there's a burning question that you thought would be asked, something that you thought is fantastic in your career, maybe it's happened since you submitted your application form, you've been promoted, you've been given a new role, whatever, that's the opportunity to say that. And you'll be given a number of minutes to add in anything that you feel the panel haven't covered that you think is an effective contribution. The interview is, as Sandra said, 45 minutes. Given that it's virtual and we've got some IT issues and document loading issues, it will tend to run on a bit longer than that. Most recent interviews I've been involved in have gone over the 50 minutes, maybe 51, 52 minutes. If we're getting to 55 minutes, there's probably a problem somewhere. But the panel will try to be flexible and will help you, give you that bit extra time to get your point across if they feel that you're struggling and you're not quite there. So how will you be assessed? Next screen, Sandra. This is about your role, your responsibilities, your experience and your expertise. And the first bullet point there is very important. If you're applying very early after maybe 4 years experience postgraduate, talk about your current role. A lot of a lot of applicants make the mistake of going back to their graduate development program where they were maybe doing rotational placements around departments, or they even go back to university projects or to summer placements they had when they were at university. That's not really demonstrating CEng level competence. They want to talk about the substantive role that you're currently in and recent projects that you've worked on. It's about your responsibilities, whether they're technical or non-technical, your experience, what you learnt, your expertise, what knowledge you've gained that's gone beyond what you learnt at university. You need to do most of the talking. You have to achieve 2 2s and 3 3s in the competencies. All the competencies have equal weighting. There is a bit of a myth that's gone around for years that competencies A and B are the true engineering competencies and that you have to achieve level 3 in both of those. That is not the case. All competencies have equal weighting. So if you're someone who's heavily involved in research, development and design, A and B are probably going to be your strongest areas. If you're someone who's a project manager, business development, C and D are possibly going to be your strongest competencies. And everyone, as I've said, should be able to achieve a 3 in Competence E. I would stress in Competence E, it's entitled Professional Standards. A lot of people make the mistake of thinking it means technical standards and start to rhyme off ASME codes and ISO standards that they work to. That's not what this is about. They've been covered earlier in the earlier competencies. Bit of advice, answer the questions that are asked. Don't waffle. If you don't understand the question, ask for clarification. Have that supporting information with you and ready, teed up to go. Don't be scrabbling around looking for it on your desktop. If you have to pick up a bit of paper and scribble a drawing and show it to the camera, that is fine. Don't use them too much. Offer them, but don't push them. And they have to be manageable and accessible. I would reckon no more than 3 or 4 pages. A nice clear photograph or simple line diagram is worth much more than screeds and screeds of documents and drawings. Have a copy of your application form with you for your own reference. If you have to stop for a moment just to remind yourself what you said, if you've been asked a question about a project, that's perfectly okay. But please don't work from a script. Some candidates come along with pre-prepared answers to questions that aren't going to be asked. If you've completed your application form properly and you've read it beforehand, you don't need a separate script. What is useful to do is to number the sub-competencies when you're preparing your application form. You only have 400 words, and the 400 words is across perhaps 2, 3, 4, even 5 sub-competencies. It's useful just to put that sub-competence at the start of the paragraph. It's much easier for the panel to know what point you're trying to make. In terms of scoring, the scores, as I mentioned, you need 2 at level 2 and 3 at level 3. Level 4 is deemed expert. So someone with a lot of experience, a lot of specialist knowledge in a particular area can look for 4s. 4s tend not to happen for candidates who are applying quite early in their career. 4s come with specialist deep knowledge or senior responsibility, management responsibility or technical responsibility. 3, you should be trying to aim for 3s in most areas. Perform the activity in a complex or non-routine context. So some significant responsibility and autonomy, and you're potentially overseeing the work of others. It is not essential that you have line management responsibility to be a CEng or an IEng, but the panel are looking for some degree of resource management, whether that's subcontractors, direct staff, project teams, even if you're pulled together for short periods of time to work on a project, that you've got some kind of resource management. You've prepared the budget, you're managing the spend, you're perhaps supervising graduates or apprentices. Level 2 means you know what you're doing, but it's not really at the level of a CEng, and hence my point about not using examples from early in your graduate development program or your university projects or summer placements. Level 1 is really means you're really not at the level to apply. All of the guidance is mentioned in UK Spec and on the IMechE website, and there are examples given of what that actually means. And that's a summary sheet of what the sort of documentation that's prepared at the end of every interview by the panel. The panel, the chair and the co-panel produce the same documentation. So under A, they will provide a score and the examples of where they felt you've met the competence requirements, and similarly across B, C, D, and E. Competence awarded in this particular example are 4 3s and a 2, which is a recommendation to elect a member. Thank you. So I'll pass you back to Sandra, who will now take you into case history.
Thanks very much, Stuart. That's really helpful. Thank you. The case history that I'd like to share with you this evening is from one of our members, Bruce Taylor. And Bruce used to be very heavily involved with the IMechE Young Members panel in Aberdeen. He graduated back in 2008 with a BEng honours degree. He planned to do further learning and didn't quite get round to it, and he ended up doing the career learning assessment. Applied for his CEng status, sent in his application back in early 2020, so earlier this year. Did his virtual PRI in June and got the email from my colleagues in London to say he'd been successful in September. So he was delighted with that and very pleased, and he very kindly took part in the last event that we did. This event is part of a series of events, and the first one we did was back in September, where we talked about preparing your application, and he prepared these slides and was able to take part in that event. So I thought they would be useful to share with you this evening, and thanks to Bruce for agreeing to let me share these slides with you this evening. But he also prepared some drawings, as Stuart has advised, prepare some drawings and have them to hand so that you can share them with the panel. He found that the interview facilitator, having him, was very helpful, helped him to settle in, helped him to relax before the interview started. During the course of the interview, the assessors introduced themselves. They were from different industries. Bruce works in oil and gas. The interviewers on the day worked in different industry sectors. Started off by asking him to give a brief overview, quickly moved on to A and B, and he was very pleased to have the supporting documents to hand. And he realised after about 5 to 10 minutes, it was very obvious that the panel were on his side. The technical questions were straightforward. Kind of questions he was asked on the day was, tell us about how you assessed this problem and communicated it. This paragraph in your application sounds like it would have been challenging. How did you find it, and what did you do to understand the subject? So very important as well not to use jargon or abbreviations. They quickly moved on from competence A and B, and Bruce had an impression that it was very obvious they knew his application form well. So it was obvious from the questions that the assessors were asking him on the day that they had a good understanding of his work and they had carefully read through his application form. Competencies C, D and E, they spent slightly less time on them than he thought they would, but from his perspective, he felt that they required more thought. He was also asked questions on managing budgets and managing others, managing the relationship with vendors that he works with. And Bruce found that his experience with the Young Members panel was really useful. He was also asked if he contributed to any joint industry projects, asked about the code of conduct, ethics. He was also able to explain that his own employer's code of conduct was quite similar to the IMechE code of conduct. Now, Bruce's CPD plan had been impacted by COVID-19, so for his interview he had drafted an alternative and discussed it with the interview panel. So do you remember we said earlier that it's useful to have a copy of your application to hand, etc., and at the end of the application, at the end of the interview rather, they will say to you, you know, is there anything you wish to bring to our attention that we didn't discuss? This was where Bruce introduced the fact that his development action plan had changed and discussed his new plan with them. He also had prepared a checklist of all the points he wanted to cover, because 45 minutes is a very short period of time, and it's very easy, if you're a little bit anxious about the interview, to forget important information. So we normally recommend that you have a checklist to hand detailing all the points you want to get across to the interviewers during the interview, so that you do that during the interview rather than a couple of hours after the interview has taken place that you think, oh gosh, I didn't mention A or B or C, which was actually important. So in that, he mentioned that he'd taken part in the Speak Out for Engineering competition, that he was an IMechE ambassador, and that he'd also received a letter of recognition for all the time he'd spent volunteering for IMechE. But I think the most important thing to share with you this evening is that Bruce's overall feeling was that the interview was enjoyable, and it was nice to have people take an interest in his work. So don't just take our word for it this evening. This is feedback directly from a recent successful applicant. So try and relax and enjoy the process. So what happens after your interview takes place? You don't get the results on the day. The interview panel needs to make a recommendation, and that recommendation goes to our professional review committee. And people who are successful, so applicants who are awarded the minimum score, as Stuart has explained, are elected as members. If you're not successful, we will tell you exactly why you have not been successful, and you can reapply. So before you submit your application, if you wish, you can get a written critique done by emailing your draft application over to me. You can see my email address on the screen at the moment. And this is a service that's available to anybody who's not on MPDS. If you are on MPDS, your mentor will be able to do this for you. We often get asked as well, why are people not successful? And I would say the main reasons that certainly I've come across over the years for deferral has been poor use of the allotted time. So people who just simply fail to communicate and answer the questions that are put to them well. So people, for example, get very nervous on the day and perhaps don't communicate as well as they normally would. Or in some cases, it's obvious that they just didn't have enough work experience. So, for example, somebody was able to write a good application, but then when they were asked a technical question about something they'd mentioned in the application form, it quickly became obvious that they just didn't have enough experience. They were perhaps exaggerating the level of experience or exaggerating the level of responsibility that they had. But please do bear in mind that the success rate is over 90%. So the vast majority of people who attend the interview are successful. If you're not successful, we can provide you with help and guidance and support so that you can be successful next time around. Now, CPD is continuous professional development, and I've included a couple of slides talking about CPD this evening because it's something I get asked a lot. What exactly is IMechE looking for in terms of CPD? Well, CPD is really all about you maintaining and developing your level of competence after you've been registered with us. And on our website, there's a whole section of the website and web pages that are devoted to CPD. There's a little video on these pages, which has been devised by the Engineering Council. It's only about 2 minutes long, so I'd encourage you to have a look at that. And then once you're registered with us, there's a number of tools that you can use online to record your CPD. And CPD is really any activity that you undertake that helps you to manage and maintain and develop your level of competence. So it could be self-study, it could be further academic study, it could be volunteering, and I'll show you lots of ways in which you can volunteer at the moment. It could be attending events or organising events. It could be attending training courses. One of the myths about CPD is that people think it has to be a paid for training course. Now, while it might be a paid for training course, it doesn't have to be. And also, most importantly, the stuff that you're doing on a day-to-day basis in the workplace will allow you to develop your CPD. So don't underestimate how important the work that you're doing on a day-to-day basis is in terms of managing and maintaining your CPD. Now, with COVID, we've had to move all of our events online, and we've curated all these events on our webinar hub. Now, I've taken a screen grab of this hub to share with you this evening, just to give you a taste and flavour of the kind of events that are available. And of course, this has been added to all the time. And you can see our events are broadly broken down in terms of industry and special events, personal and professional development, and our membership and professional registration events. They're also recorded by engineering topic as well. There's over 60 hours of webinars that you can watch on YouTube if you wish. And of course, they will count as CPD activities. Very important to mention that to you this evening. Andy mentioned earlier that he's very involved with the Edinburgh Young Members Panel. But if you go to the homepage of the website, you can see all of the committees that are set up throughout the UK and further afield. And of course, getting involved with these committees is also an excellent opportunity for CPD as well. We've also got a fantastic library, just to remind you that the library is available for you to use. And now, of course, so many resources are available for you to access directly online. So conducting some research using the IMechE library could count as CPD. Equally, volunteering with the divisions and groups, because all of these, the institution is very democratic in that it's run by the members for the members. So getting involved with the local area committees, or indeed the divisions and groups committees, will also count as a CPD activity as well. And further details of all these divisions and groups are on the website. So well worth having a look at if you're not familiar with them already. We also organise lots of student competitions every year, and you may have taken part in these competitions as a student in the past. Don't forget that as a registrant or as somebody who's working in industry or academia, we rely on a huge army of volunteers to help us set up and run these events. So with Formula Student, for example, we need over 400 volunteers to run this event. And we're lucky that we've got lots of people who step forward to offer to act as volunteers every year. For 2021, if you wish to act as a volunteer for a Formula Student, we're accepting applications from December, so from next month. But there are other challenges as well, and details of all of these are on the website too. So hopefully Andy has been posting details of the links in the chat box we've been going through the slides this evening. The support network is also available to any member that finds himself in a time of need. And volunteering with the support network, perhaps to do social visits, will also count as a CPD activity. And finally, all of the events that we organise through the business development team are on the website. So if you're one of the people who's listening in this evening who perhaps is starting out on completing your application form, please do get in touch, and you can access this page through the webinar hub. So just to summarise what we've been talking about this evening before we move on to the Q&A section, try to be confident at your interview. Remember that you're the expert on your career. You're talking about your career in front of an interested audience, and there's very few opportunities in life where we can do that. So relax and enjoy the experience. Make sure you listen and answer the questions that are being asked rather than the questions you think they might ask you. Always make sure you use the first person. It's all about you. It's all about what you did and why you did it. Make sure you read through your application. It can be some months between submitting your application and attending your interview. So make sure you're fully familiar with the content of your application so that any questions that you come up, you'll be immediately able to answer. We would also suggest that you try and have a mock interview, if at all possible. You could get a mentor, sponsor, colleague or manager, or perhaps your partner to do a mock interview for you. If nothing else, it'll just show you how amazingly quickly the 45 minutes will fly by. Most people say they're really surprised at how quickly the 45 minutes goes by. So make sure you're well prepared for it. Checklist I've mentioned earlier, so a little list of bullet points of all the points you want to cover, and have that to hand so that you don't leave any important information out or forget it on the day. And do try to enjoy yourself. It's an opportunity to meet with senior engineers. And lastly, please do bear in mind that the assessors are looking for reasons to elect you. On paper, it looks as though you meet all the requirements. You just have to convince them that you are the person you said you are and you've done the work that you said you've done in your application form. So thank you very much for joining us this evening. We'll now move on to questions from you. If, for example, you've got a question and we don't get a chance or it's not covered this evening, just drop me an email after this evening and we'll be able to help you. And likewise,